The population cheat code. Haber-Bosch left the gates and hit soil like fuel on a cold engine. In the 1940s and 1950s, a handful of agronomists looked at synthetic nitrogen and said, what if we tune the whole farm around this? Wheat that once leaned on manure and clover suddenly had a jetpack. Extension agents ran side-by-side plots, one pass with ammonium nitrate, one without. The fertilized rows stood darker, taller, earlier. Harvest days turned into neighborhood debates. Men in caps rubbing kernels between fingers, doing math in their heads, weighing the risk of a new bill against a fuller bin. Here's the promise they chased: shorten the hunger window. In places where a late monsoon meant empty pantries, nitrogen underwrote risk. Add a few bags at planting and the crop had a buffer. A farmer in Punjab told his son in 1968, this season we're not praying for rain alone. The new wheat varieties, shorter, stiffer, hungrier, met the nitrogen with gratitude and greed. Combine that with better irrigation and pesticides, and the yield graph bent upward hard. Governments declared victories. Newspapers printed photos of grain mountains, a miracle with a ticking meter. But the miracle had a meter running. The first year, 2 bags per acre looked like free money. The second, 3 bags were just insurance. By the 5th, the soil felt wired, flush with nitrates after rain, tired and gasping by late season. Microbes that once brokered quiet deals between roots and minerals got pushed to the sideline. What nobody held a ceremony for was a funeral of sorts. The old nitrogen cycle started to fade from memory in fields that no longer grew legumes between harvests. Meanwhile, the body count of nitrogen told its own story. Stable isotope studies later traced roughly half the nitrogen in human tissues to ammonia born in steel reactors. Think about that. Birthdays, hospital meals, school lunches, so many meals stamped by a process that began as a high-pressure gamble. It fed us. It also rewired our expectations. Once you've seen a field double, it's hard to go back to enough. There was always a catch, and it shows up where rivers slow down. Nitrogen not taken up by crops doesn't disappear, it runs off. The Mississippi carries the leftovers like a conveyor belt, dropping them in the Gulf where algae bloom, die, and leave fish gasping in low-oxygen water. Farmers 1,000 miles upstream never see the dead zone, but fishermen do. A shrimper in Louisiana marks the line each summer where the engine hums but the nets stay light. In the village ledger, the numbers grew nuanced. One family in Jalisco spread fertilizer on a hillside field and watched the corn stand straighter than their grandfather's stories. The local buyer loved the volume. So did the loan officer, until prices jumped. Fuel rose, fertilizer followed, and suddenly the margin that paid for school uniforms evaporated into a richer green they couldn't eat. Yield doubled, debt tripled. At the kitchen table, the father dragged a finger down the receipt and said to his daughter, we grew for them this year. Breeding kept pace with the new habit. Seed companies selected lines that thrived on heavy nitrogen diets, short straw to prevent lodging big grain heads, precise timing. It worked beautifully if you could afford the inputs. This is where dependence became architecture. Credit lines were written around fertilizer purchases. Crop insurance assumed modern yields. Contracts penalized shortfalls. The system didn't force your hand. It wrote the only hand that made sense. Meanwhile, something quiet happened in the soil. Fields that once breathed through roots and fungi became compacted under bigger machines and simplified rotations. Organic matter plateaued or slipped. Salts crept in where irrigation and fertilizers mixed badly. To fix the yellowing leaves, many farmers did what the booklet suggested, a little more nitrogen. And for a while, it worked. The plant greened. The photos looked great. Then energy prices nudged the floor out. Natural gas is the hydrogen source for most ammonia, and when its price jumps, the nitrogen bill follows. That means a cold winter in Europe or a pipeline hiccup can ripple into a grocery bill months later. In 2021 and 2022, ammonia plants in parts of Europe went dark because gas was too expensive to justify the run. A co-op manager in Iowa told his members, if we can't secure product by March, plant accordingly. Some cut rates, some gambled, all felt the knot in the stomach. The Green Revolution's least romantic truth is its geometry. We pushed inputs in, pulled calories out, and ignored the loop. Food didn't just feed people. It fed livestock, ethanol plants, and waste bins. Half the field went to feed a cow. A chunk of that cow went to a burger that threw away a bun. Efficiency on the acre didn't guarantee cents on the plate. And yet the sales pitch held steady. Without synthetic fertilizer, billions starved. What it left out was context. Waste, diet, loss, and smarter use. None of this makes nitrogen the villain. It makes the tap the lever. Who controls the molecules, the price, the delivery windows, the rules of disclosure? That's where the story sharpens. Because once you build a food system on a chemical fuse, whoever owns the match owns your calendar. And in the years when that match costs triple, the fuse hisses and you taste it at checkout. That's the cheat code's truth. It worked, it locked in, and it started charging rent. The three-letter lock on food. Follow the nitrogen to the checkout line and it spells three letters. NPK farmers joke that plants don't read brand names, they read nutrients. Nitrogen for leaves, phosphorus for roots and energy, potassium for strength and water balance. Simple on a soil test, brutal in geopolitics. Because those three letters don't live in the same places and none of them move without fuel. Start with N, we already met the molecule, ammonia. It doesn't come from a cave, it comes from factories welded to cheap natural gas. Wherever gas is abundant and policy is friendly, you'll see gray stacks on the horizon and rail cars lined up like a pulse through the heartland. Shut off the gas, and you don't just dim a plant, you pull a thread tied to spring planting calendars half a world away. Meanwhile, P might as well stand for passport. Phosphorus is dug from rock, not conjured from air, and the richest seams sit under a tight map. Morocco and the disputed Western Sahara carry a mother lode. OCP, the state-owned Moroccan giant, doesn't just sell phosphate. It sets Saturday morning moods in grain belts when their export calendars shift. Industry analysts talk about OCP's leverage like it's weather, commanding a dominant share of high-grade reserves and long-term capacity. A de facto choke that polite reports call market leadership and farmers call, please don't blink. When a buyer in Kenya hears a whisper about delays from Jorf Lasfar, he starts calling growers to push back planting. Potassium shows its cards in winter headlines. Potash comes from underground in Canada and from vast operations in Russia and Belarus. The mines are towns unto themselves. When sanctions land on Minsk or a rail strike snarls Saskatchewan, the ripples ride barges and balance sheets from Sao Paulo to Shanghai. You don't need to read a geopolitics brief. You just need to watch a spreadsheet on a co-op manager's desk where potash quotes change the tone in the room. Put N, P, and K together, and you get companies that speak across borders with the confidence of oil majors. Yara in Norway, Nutrien and Mosaic in North America, CF Industries in the US, OCP in Morocco, Fos Agro in Russia, Eurochem with tentacles across continents. They don't sell fertilizer as a favor, they sell it like oxygen. And because logistics are half the story, ports and rail become characters too. A single congested terminal can turn a province's corn into a bargaining chip. That's the quiet cartel effect. Few hands on the tap, everyone else checking their pulse. Here's a day in the life of that choke. A dockworker in Tampa watches a storm delay unloaders by 12 hours. 12 hours becomes 48 because the swell won't drop. A bulk carrier full of DAP circles offshore, burning time and cash. Upstream, a phosphate mine runs steady. Downstream, a retail yard tells a farmer, we can do 2/3 of your order now, the rest in 10 days. 10 days bumps a planting window into a different rainfall pattern. Yield moves like a rumor. Price setting isn't a whiteboard exercise, it's a chess match with customs paperwork. Tariffs tilt the board. Export bans turn screws. When India sweetens tenders, vessels divert mid-ocean. When China tightens urea exports, Southeast Asia feels it first. Allegations of cartels come and go with court filings and settlements, but the effect on a grower's text thread is the same. Lock it now or lose it later. A retailer in Ohio watches international news the way a trader watches oil. Because in a bad week, nitrogen acts like crude with a crop dusting license. There's a reason the packaging fixates on three numbers. Those NPK ratios turn a bag into a decision. Behind each number sits a supply chain that's anything but equal. Nitrogen's number is pinned to gas hubs and compressor uptime. Phosphorus number is pinned to mine permits, conveyor belts, and a handful of port codes. Potassium's number checks for rail car availability and the mood in Moscow. When one digit jumps, the blend shifts, the price slips, and somebody down the line recalibrates what a normal season looks like. What nobody at the point of sale sees is the leverage baked into maps. A smallholder in Ghana doesn't haggle with Morocco. He haggles with a warehouse that haggles with a distributor that haggles with a state-backed exporter. The distance between the spade and the boardroom is an ocean crossed by contracts most farmers never read. That distance is profitable. It also turns famines into policy outcomes when the wrong three letters move the wrong way at the wrong time. Micro story, a buyer at a flour mill in Cairo gets an email at 3:17 a.m. DAP allocation reduced 25%. He swallows hard, not because he buys DAP, he doesn't, but because he knows farmers will. Next harvest tickles lower, wheat bids tickle higher. Bread subsidies in his city don't move fast, street tempers do. And this is where logistics become law without a vote. Ports, rail lines, and insurance underwriters can do what parliaments avoid: ration access. A sanctioned ship isn't just a ship, it's a missing spring application. A damaged rail trestle isn't just infrastructure, it's a protein shift in a child's lunch 6 months later. The NPK triangle was supposed to be agronomy shorthand. It grew teeth. So yes, the plant reads nutrients, not logos, but your grocery bill reads balance sheets. The triangle sits on a tripod of gas fields, phosphate basins, and potash mines. Shake one leg and the whole world leans. Now watch what happens when the law calls these molecules inputs, waves them past the food rules, and lets the tripod owners name the tune. Inputs vs. food. While that NPK triangle tightened its grip, lawmakers drew a line you don't see on the receipt. On one side, food, on the other, inputs. Cross that line with a bag of fertilizer and the rulebook changes. The tomato on your plate answers to food safety laws, traceability, contamination thresholds, recall procedures, nutrition labels. The nitrogen that grew it gets treated like an industrial chemical that never touches your lips, because technically it doesn't. It just moves through soil, into leaves, into you. Get this, regulators in most countries carved out an entire category for farm inputs. Fertilizers were placed with cement, solvents, and industrial gases, subject to product standards for purity and handling, but not the kind of scrutiny applied to bread or baby formula. The logic sounded tidy. You don't consume fertilizer, but call it an input and you've solved a legal problem, not a biological one. Molecules don't respect paperwork. They move. That's the loophole. Industrial input rules where food exposure logic belongs. Here, S where the loophole breathes. Labels on fertilizer bags list NPK ratios and sometimes a short ingredients line, but proprietary blends and coatings sit behind confidentiality. Manufacturers call it trade secret protection. Farmers call it a shrug. There isn't a mandate to disclose full life cycle data the way food producers disclose allergens or additives. You won't find a nitrogen footprint per pound of corn on the shelf. You won't find the origin mine for the phosphorus that ended up in your baguette. The packet at the field gate stands invisible at the grocery gate. Meanwhile, the cost of that invisibility lands in places that don't send invoices. Excess nitrogen leaches into groundwater. Local clinics track blue baby advisories after heavy rains. Downstream utilities install nitrate removal equipment and raise water bills. Nobody itemizes fertilizer runoff surcharge. Estuaries flip to seasonal dead zones. Fishermen shift docks or quit. The price of shrimp inches up, and a diner in Omaha wonders why the special changed. Externalities sound academic, until the well behind your house needs a reverse osmosis unit you can't afford. And the accounting trick goes further. When a chemical is classified as an industrial input, emissions and spills get tracked in environmental ledgers, not food safety systems. That means the surveillance net misses what matters to eaters. Upstream issues rarely trigger downstream recalls. A problem at a phosphate reactor might set off occupational hazard reports and fines. It won't pull cereal from shelves. In the produce aisle, a lettuce E. coli scare makes news. In a fertilizer plant, a contamination scare becomes a compliance note. Lobbyists worked hard to keep that line intact. Farm bills and subsidy programs frame fertilizer as essential infrastructure, bundling access and credit into the definition of modern agriculture. Procurement rules reward volume and uniformity, which favors synthetic inputs that meet spec and ship like clockwork. State houses hear about feeding the world. Committee rooms hear about regulatory certainty. Somewhere in that phrase, the right to know morphs into the right to sell. Micro story, a state legislator tour a gleaming granulation plant. Safety posters, hard hats, a tidy control room that looks like a spaceship command deck. The briefing packet says the product is safe when used as directed. He nods. Later, he drives past a sign warning about nitrate levels in a rural well field. Different agencies, different budgets. No single place to connect the dots unless you're a parent staring at a tap. There's a detail most shoppers don't realize. Food safety law is built around endpoints. It watches the finished product and the kitchen. But fertilizers change the starting line of the food system. If we inverted the logic, if we treated inputs with food-grade seriousness, Blends would carry disclosure like nutrition panels, nitrogen source, phosphorus origin, additive list, known contaminants, and a declared runoff risk under typical use. That wouldn't be a sticker for farmers alone. It would be a QR code in the store aisle that links the apple in your hand to the nitrogen that fed it. Industry argues that standardized agronomy, not shopper-facing labels, is the right fix. They say agronomic recommendations already account for environmental risk, and too much disclosure would confuse buyers and expose trade secrets. What nobody adds in the press release: opacity preserves pricing power. If you don't know how your bag differs from the competitor, you haggle on brand and delivery, not on origin, contamination baselines, or carbon intensity. And speaking of carbon, the clean ammonia pitch thrives in this blind spot. Blue and green labels sell tax credits and comfort, but the capture rates, methane leaks, and shipping hazards live in technical annexes few read. Because fertilizer isn't food, there's no familiar consumer pressure to align claims with dinner reality. Emissions become an accounting game against baselines that never enter the grocery conversation. Meanwhile, farmers sit in the crossfire. Their contracts and credit lines assume fertilizer use, their water quality rules tighten, their customers ask for sustainable without paying more. When regulators do move, they aim at field practices, not upstream manufacturing. The bill lands on the person with the least pricing power in the chain. Here's the quiet consequence: the grocery store looks lawful while the system that feeds it dodges the laws we use for everything else we swallow. Call that illegal if you're talking about the spirit of food rules, not the letter. We decided on paper that the thing that most determines what ends up on your plate isn't part of food law, and the companies at the tap learn to operate in that shadow. Next, watch what happens when the same inputs can switch from bread to bombs without rewriting a single statute. The scariest fine print you never read: the war switch. To understand how inputs become policy, watch ammonia flip its badge. The same molecule that fattens wheat can shred steel when you teach it chemistry's rougher manners. In peacetime, ammonia is a promise. In wartime, it's a pipeline to explosives. No new permits, no new miracle, just valves, reactors, and schedules shifting from bread to bomb. World War I made that switch famous. Before the shooting started, empires bought Chilean nitrate for both fertilizer and munitions. Blockades cut that cord. Germany, boxed in at sea, leaned on the thing Haber and Bosch had conjured. Convert ammonia to nitric acid, marry it to glycerin or TNT precursors, and suddenly the countryside's yield map shares a blood type with artillery shells. Railway cars that used to carry sacks for fields began feeding powder line. The same foremen who bragged about bushels per acre learned to count detonations per hour. On the front lines, you could taste the chemistry. Shells arrived in volumes that defied the old nitrate calculus. Without Haber-Bosch, historians argue, Germany's supplies would have strangled sooner. With it, the war bled longer. Back home, farmers took delivery of less nitrogen and made do. In diaries, you read men arguing over whether to save seed or slaughter a hog early, while the plant over the hill worked night shifts under blackout curtains. The molecule didn't pick sides, it followed orders. WWII standardized the choreography. Governments mapped nitrogen like fuel. Ammonia plants sat on priority lists. Coal and natural gas fed them first. A plant manager might spend breakfast negotiating labor, lunch negotiating compressor parts, dinner negotiating rail slots for ammonium nitrate, now destined for both corn and cordite. In Iowa, a farmer spread AN on a spring field. In a coastal arsenal, workers pressed AN into mixtures that would leave a different kind of mark on the earth.